Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. I'm very excited to be with you today. I always get excited about the guests that I bring on because they seem to be treasures in lots of different ways. And today is no exception. There's a young woman who has written a book called Life I Swear: Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self Trust. And she's gathered together a group of many women who are young women, but mature enough to be able to look back on their lives with a sense of understanding of things that have worked and that haven't worked. And there's such honest portrayals of what these women have been navigating. And I think this helps so much for all of us to consider what we are navigating. As you know, I'm a big proponent of storytelling because I think that helps us to gain a window into each other's worlds. So I'm inviting to come on right now Chloe Dulce Louvouezo. Welcome, Chloe. Hi.
Hi, Harriet. It is so good to join you today. I just hearing your voice is so welcoming in and of itself. So I'm just happy to be in good company.
Well, this is a beautiful book. It's beautiful in all different ways, like beautiful cover.
Mm.
The design is very tender and welcoming. And then you have all these incredible voices of women who, in a way, I think defy what we have been told.
Mm.
There's a sense, I think, in the Black community that Black women have to be strong, have to be um, able to handle all challenges and with a smile on our face, or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sometimes with that moniker of angry Black woman. It's either with a
Mm-hmm.
smile or angry, really not anything in between. And you have gathered together so many stories that kind of defy that. What was your intention in creating this book?
I love that you say that because in each of the conversations I had with each of these women, we talked about how strength is a demand on us.
Hmm.
It is not a compliment and it's not complementary to our healing oftentimes. And so my process of bringing these women together, it first started with the necessity I saw in taking my own story, the things I grappled with, and putting them on paper just for my own personal healing practice. And knowing how therapeutic that was, bringing other women along that journaling journey. And so I identified the women based on, if I'm looking down, I'm looking at the book.
It's great. Go for it.
I identified the women based on experiences where we might have been able to overlap, but where our experiences were so nuanced still in and of themselves that I was able to gain a new perspective, a new view on how they dealt with grief or trauma, or how they managed to navigate their sense of identity. For me, it was important for this to be a learning experience so that I could be a student alongside this journey, but then also be able to identify women whose stories resonate with me as well. So
And
it's
and and,
been.
and much to my delight, when I open the book, the first thing I read is the foreword by Elaine Welteroth, who
Mm-hmm.
I love. As I call her my, I told her mother she's my New York daughter. I actually do have a daughter, but it's okay. Carrie allows me to have Elaine as well. Um, but Elaine started her career with me, and we are very close. And when she started in her essay, which is
Mm-hmm.
beautifully written, she talks about the connection to you and how she was able to be vulnerable with you. And in her
Mm-hmm.
book, she talks a lot about vulnerability and
Mm-hmm.
choices that weren't the best choices, especially in relationships, which tends to be true for most people. You stumble at different points. Um, can you talk about the importance of friendship and trust when you're going through these
Mm-hmm.
challenges of navigating, growing into yourself and kind of stumbling sometimes into men who aren't necessarily the best fit?
Mm, yeah, I think friendship for me has been a lifeline at many stages of my life, and when I met Elaine, and when I read that essay, the foreword written by Elaine, I just broke down in tears.
I bet.
In
Me too.
tears, just the way she's just a phenomenal writer, and her way
Yes.
she's able to capture and articulate um, every part of that experience of meeting her. And we met through a mutual friend, and I had just left a very toxic romantic relationship. And though I often say that our friendships are the most romantic relationships we have in life,
Mhm.
because they are with us from the beginning until the end often. And, I think friendships play such an important role because for those of us, and I speak for myself, who I struggled with this sense of home, this idea of home. I moved around a lot. I shuffled between many different families, many different kinds of communities, domestically across the states, and internationally. And then when I came into adulthood, I didn't have a strong sense of home. And so I attached myself to um, to relationships with men that were not healthy for me, just to feel that sense of belonging, that sense of feeling needed and feeling loved as I perceive love in young adulthood. Um, my relationship and friendship with Elaine and my friendships with girlfriends in general, who I'm able to tap into that vulnerability with, were the biggest lessons I could ever have around what I deserve, um, what I need, and how to name my needs, but also how to identify what my needs are. And so friendships have truly been a practice of um, taking ownership of how I want to show up and what I need to receive. Um, Energetically, and then also how to be a gatekeeper for those needs. And so I absolutely credit Elaine's role in my life in helping me build the confidence to name my needs. And, the beautiful thing about friendships is that they are ever evolving as you evolve into new stages of your life. And I've just been blessed to think of friendships in terms of how they allow for reinvention of ourselves as well. And so that's the beauty of really these friendships that go and stick with you through your growing pain years.
And you have included a number of friends and women who share
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable space with you in this book, and they write in such tender ways.
Mm.
There's a big, I guess, a chapter section about motherhood,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to talk about that a little bit because so many women can relate. Uh, you are incredibly vulnerable in your storytelling about being a mother, and I have one child, and
Mm-hmm.
prior to having my daughter, had a miscarriage,
Mm-hmm.
and not as late in
Mm-hmm.
term as you did, but I will say that was the most devastating experience that I've had of
Mm.
all experiences, um, because you feel this loss of life, and it's hard to survive it emotionally. And you write about it in tremendous detail. Um, what did you learn from
Mm.
both having a child and having the honor of navigating life with a child and losing a child?
Mm. Thank you for that question. It's often a question and a topic that's hard for people to talk about because it is such a tender experience. And even in wanting to ask out of either curiosity or to assist in the healing process, you're never sure what you're retriggering. And so I welcome the question. Obviously, I wrote about it, and so for me, it's been an ebb and flow of how I attach myself to that loss and that pregnancy. having my son, who was very excited about
Mm.
having a sibling. And he is such a creature of stability and a creature of wanting to feel secure within how he's seeing his family formalized, you know? And so he was just so excited for a little brother. And, you know, we had done a maternity photo shoot, and we had, you know, named his brother. And so at certain points in my grieving process, it was unclear the line between whether I was mourning for my son's loss, my son who is here with us today, or my own loss. The
Mm.
line became very blurry because my son who is here with us today, Mayel, is just an extension of my soul.
Right.
Really and truly.
How old was Mael when you suffered the miscarriage?
He was 3 years old. And
Mm.
so he was speaking. He was, you know, he had already fantasized the experiences he would have. He would talk to the belly. And so, you know, he had moments where he would just, for the next year, where he would just sit and grieve. And that looked different in different ways. And so that blurred line was probably the biggest challenge in trying to navigate. It's also, you know, I have friends that I've met since coming out with this part of my story, and that they didn't have a child before. And so they grappled with, am I a mother? Am I not a mother? You know, and what defines motherhood? What defines a mother-child relationship? And so for me, this experience truly allowed myself to, for the first time, have so many feelings all at once. And you can want to move on and still honor a life. And you should also, you know, for me, I had to redefine some things, like, what does moving on, what does that mean? um, and for me, it doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean dismissing. It means allowing myself to be present in my joy today. And I think that I deserve that. And I think my son deserves that. But it 100% was one of the hardest things to come out of, because I was so public with that pregnancy. I was excited for it. My family was, everyone in our community was aware that we were expecting. And so the hardest part too was not only drawing the line between my loss and my son's, but also I had experienced, I went through a breakup with their father 1.5 months prior to losing the pregnancy. And so I was grieving a lot of things at one
Yes.
time. And so I had to ask myself, what am I grieving exactly? Am I
Sure.
grieving the idea of a family? Am I grieving on behalf of my son? Am I grieving the heartbreak? Is there resentment there that I am lumping into this grief?
Mm.
And so for me, I had intense social anxiety. Um, I couldn't go to the office, and so my manager at the time actually told me to take a year off.
Wow.
Take a year off. I was expecting to spend a year of maternity leave, and when I lost that pregnancy, I I just could not function, and it would have made no sense for me to go to work.
Mm. What
And
were you
my
doing at the time?
I was doing communications for a large foundation,
Hmm.
and my manager, who was a mother of three, said, "Go home and don't come back until you feel yourself."
No.
even if that takes 52 weeks.
Wow, what a
And
blessing.
so I'm telling you, I mean, when we talk about time and you mentioned maturity, the word maturity stuck with
Mhm.
me. And that takes some time and being
Yeah.
patient in the maturity of our self-awareness. But how I spent that year was essentially how this book came to be. Is I took time coming out of that anxiety of the questions, what happened, or congratulations, people who didn't know the backstory or had
Yeah.
so many questions about both the separation and the loss, and they just didn't even know how to work through those conversations. And so bringing it back to the book, at the tail end of that year, I had done so much healing work in those first 9 months. The last 3 months that were left, I said, how am I going to package what I've learned about myself and the
Mhm.
world and my perspective on womanhood and motherhood into something that can be an artifact for me to remember this time and to document? And that's when I decided to do the book.
Fantastic. Hey guys, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5
Mm-hmm.
FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And today we're talking with the author of a very tender book of essays called Life I Swear: Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self Trust. And the author is Chloe Louvouezo. And just look, you take out the tissues when you're reading this book for the right reasons, because
Mm.
I feel that the essays really do pierce the heart in a good way. You know, sometimes we need to open our hearts in order
Mm-hmm.
to examine what's there, to have an honest exploration of what's going on. I think most of the women in the book are, I'm looking just at their pictures, and you know that I could be wrong, but I'm thinking late 20s to mid 30s. Is that most of them?
That is most of them. And then there is one woman who is in her 60s as
Ooh.
well, an anomaly. But I thought it was important to be inclusive of geography, age, and background within Blackness.
And I appreciate that you have also, but that the range is good, but also women who are 30 something. I remember when I turned 30, I really felt like that was an incredible turning point. Like, I know some things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know everything, and I knew I didn't, but I like, okay, I have a sense that here's some things that I've done that make sense. Here's some things that do not make sense. I can choose to not do some of those things that I did in the past.
Right.
But you also talk, and you talk about those things in the book, but also there's a sense of being able to forgive yourself
Mm-hmm.
for whatever you may have thought, said, or
Mm-hmm.
done that didn't serve you. Can you speak to this notion of forgiveness uh, and how it manifests in your book?
Sure. Um, when I had mentioned the intention of starting my own stories was really to get all those things out of my head and put them on paper. Some of those things um, were coupled with shame, regret, being hard on myself for myself, the many versions of myself, for allowing myself to be susceptible to things I should have known better. You should have known. And so part of my homework to myself is this notion I call self examination. It's really like studying my patterns. And I think in our 30s, we're old enough to have had patterns in our adult years. And we're at the crux of trying to either correct our patterns or shift them so that we have healthier patterns, um, because we can't afford to carry what didn't work for us into spaces that we want to um, be filled with aspiration and purpose and living and believing in a bigger way. And so for me, you know, I put pen to paper because I needed to forgive those past selves in order to be able to rewrite my own narrative. And when we get stuck on what we don't feel proud of, and we allow those things to be the narrative that we then attach our self-love or self-worth to, we're we're stagnant in a sense. And so for me, it was important to write those stories on paper and then make the conscious decision to rewrite my own narrative. What do I want to be? And I can only look to the future of the woman I want to be when I deeply understand, forgive, and love the woman I used to be.
That's beautiful. A question that I ask everyone during this period is, what did you do during COVID?
Mm-hmm.
And you described a few
Yeah.
minutes ago, well, you made this book, but way more than making this book. You took time to heal and
Mm-hmm.
to tend to yourself, and then to collect people you love and trust to share in this experience, because you easily could have made this your memoir.
Mm-hmm.
There are enough stories, and I like the way you sprinkle your stories throughout
Yeah.
the book. There, again, I'm going to say gentle is something that
Mm-hmm.
I feel throughout this
Yeah.
book. You gently insert yourself, and then all these other women, and because you have photos of them, we
Mm-hmm.
get to see these beautiful women in all of their incarnations, and then read their vulnerabilities,
Yeah.
which, as we know, we're very good at making ourselves look fabulous,
Yes.
but you know, uh, then pulling off the proverbial mask to share the truth that helped to make us who we are is so incredibly important. Um, you you talk about men in particular. You talk about Guy,
Mm.
and what you learned from being in a relationship that you thought was going to be one beautiful creative way and turned out not to be. Tell us about that.
Guy. Um, so I met Guy when I was 22 years old. He was 38 years old. And I think that in and of itself is telling where I was mentally and where he might have been. The title of that essay is called Unhealed Wounds. And I named it that because I do believe that while there is this understanding that the person who is being hurt, and in that case, myself at that time, at a tender age, is the only one with the wounds. But usually, and I might say always, the person inflicting on the offense also has deep wounds. And I think that relates to romantic relationships. It can also relate to our relationship with the country, if you think of it in those broader contexts. But it is what happens when two people with deep-seated wounds come together and look to each other to mend them. And that creates a codependency. And so, in lieu of close family ties or a sense of identity, more, I guess, a sense of home, a sense of structure, I looked to this person at a very impressionable time in my life, right out of college, looking at the world as being so big and so daunting. And so the person who welcomed me in, so it felt like, was the first person I kind of rest my hat on. And so, I do go into detail about my relationship with him that in the beginning felt I could see myself in this person, and I could see myself in this person because he reflected some of the voids that I too had in my life. Though our journeys were entirely different, our upbringing, and I grew up overseas for the most part, and he grew up very local to the city. And he grew up in, I think I describe it in the book as a life of crime and punishment. And there was something intriguing about that. And I don't think that's unique to young women, the bad guy,
Bad boy.
the bad boy. And so I was intrigued. And as someone who loves stories, and for me, I always try to lean into understanding and empathy. And the more I understand someone's background, the more I'm able to forgive their patterns that came before me. But in this case, to a detriment. And so over the course of this 5-year relationship, it sucked me in to, abuse of different kinds. And I think that it's important to be explicit about the journey of this particular relationship, because it's an example of how narrow our definition of abuse is. And
Yeah.
sometimes we think it's just physical abuse, and we don't categorize other types of abuse, whether it's psychological or whatever kind of manipulation happens before someone puts their hands on you. You need the most extreme thing to happen. For me, the most extreme thing was actually not him putting his hands on me. The most extreme thing was him impregnating someone else while we were together, and she delivering the baby. And so that relationship was defining in my early 20s, between 22 and 27. It absolutely crippled me in one sense, but you can't go through you can't get to the flowers without going through the fire. And so I am in retrospect grateful for the growth that came out of that, because it forced me to understand that certain behaviors are not okay, and how to be more protective of the people I let in my life. And that starts with just being more self-aware.
And I'm really glad that you did write about it,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of times people do not share those stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned in Elaine's book, she writes about a number of not
Mm-hmm.
so great relationships that she had. I think it's important, especially when people are in the public eye, that they're willing to tell the truth about things in their life that perhaps show something that you don't want to show. We don't want
Mm-hmm.
people to know that we've had hardship, that there's been abuse. We want to
Mm-hmm.
feel stronger than that. Again, we are super women, especially Black women have been taught that we have to be that, and to you know take down the mask and tell the truth. And look, this is
Mm-hmm.
what you had to go through, and by going through it, you've come out a better person and learned lessons. I think that
Mm-hmm.
can be very healing for
Mm-hmm.
others, who then can examine their own lives honestly, to kind of determine where they are and where they're headed. Let me remind folks, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And I have to say, I love that we can listen online, and we can listen in the moment, and also on demand, because we live in an on demand world. So
Mm-hmm.
technology has actually become incredibly helpful during this period of COVID, because we had to figure out how to use it so that we could engage. And so this is a good thing. I am talking to the author of a very tender book called Life I Swear: Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self Trust. The author is Chloe Louvouezo. And this book, she's very generously offering to the WBAI family for a donation of $60 to WBAI. You can ask for a copy of Life I Swear, and we will send it to you. As you all know, who are regular listeners, we are completely listener sponsored radio, which means we don't exist without you. With this covenant of family that we've created, I've been doing this show for more than 3 years now, bringing on all kinds of people who share their truth, who share their dreams, and how they've been able to manifest them. with the point being, everyone who's listening, the goal is for you to be inspired to leap into your dreams. It is not just to listen and go, oh, that was nice. We don't have time for it. That was nice. It has to be, I feel ready to take action. And I hope that as we are talking with Chloe, who's created this book, Life I Swear, that you get a sense of being able to be unmasked and look at your truth and examine it and put it forth. And sometimes someone just asked me the other day, what do you do when you journal all these things down that come up in meditation and you know that bubble forth? One of the things that I learned to do is you actually can burn them in a sacred fire. It doesn't always have to be a it doesn't always have to be a book. This is beautiful as a book. Yours could be a book, but it could also be just an offering that you allow everything that's coming forth to go, and you give it, like you write in your book, Chloe, about giving it to the sun. And
Mm.
and spiritually you can release it, and maybe that gives you more space to pursue whatever it is you're supposed to pursue in your heart. So if you would like a copy of Life I Swear, Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self-Trust, please make a contribution of $60 to WBAI. You can call us at 212 209 2950. I'll repeat, 212 209 2950. You can also go online to give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org, and you follow the prompts and just let them know that you are making a contribution to Dreamleapers and that you want this book, Life I Swear. So, Chloe, one of the things that you talk about at the very beginning of the book, when you're introducing yourself to us, and as you said, yourselves to us,
Mhm.
you have lived in many places, and you uh, explore an understanding of your identity, and you even talk about when people asking you where are you from and how difficult it is to answer. I
Mm.
want to start with, when people see your name, Louvouezo, I'm sure, like, what's that name? Where's
Mhm.
that name from? But so we can even start with that. But part of this book is about identity. Can you tell us about your identity and what that journey has been like to sort of claim and own the various identities that make you you?
Mm. Oh, yes. Thank you for that question. It has been, I do believe it's been one of the main themes of my life has been around identity and around this idea of home. Um, so my on my mother's side, I am white American on her side by way of Croatia, which my middle name is Dulce. It comes from my great grandmother Dulce. On my father's side, he and his family are Congolese from the Republic of Congo. I was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo across the river. And then my mother's career in international development took us to Niger, which is in West Africa. And so while I always knew I was African, I always identified with being African. Um, Even in Niger, I was not Nigerian. In Congo, I have never, outside of the first 2 years of my life, I hadn't lived there. And so even that part of my family felt distant to me. I was the only person of color on my white side. And so it was hard to name.
Chloe, how were you treated by your mother's family, given that you were the only person of color? Because sometimes that doesn't go well. How were you treated?
Yeah, I mean, I was treated fine and fairly. I knew that my grandparents loved me. There was part of me that felt they didn't understand me. We have a different vernacular. We have a different kind of social culture. And it was interesting because the only people that I saw, sorry, did that make noise on your end?
No,
Um,
I got you.
okay. The only people that I saw them interacting with my grandparents, who were kind of our home base, was when they did volunteer service or in their veteran circles. Ironically, though, both my mother and her sister married Black men. And so, even when my mom describes her mother, who's now no longer with us, she says the only day that she ever saw her mother cry was the day um, MLK died. And so um, I always felt appreciated, but that doesn't mean I always felt a sense of belonging, because I knew there was part of my experience in this world they could never relate to, and vice versa. There were spaces I could never enter, or I would be the exception. And being the exception as an outlier does not feel good or exceptional.
Well,
And
and you write in your book about, especially when you were in Niger, and that really class becomes a
mm-hmm,
bigger issue sometimes than race, and I think that's
yeah,
everywhere. And being part of the American
mm-hmm,
community set you apart from others.
mm-hmm,
Uh, Having more means
mm-hmm.
than perhaps other people set you apart. So, what were the landmines that you experienced there?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that it taught me is that everything in context, right? Including race, and how we might define race in the United States, in the South, is different than how we do in Seattle, where I went to high school, and is definitely different in Niger. And so in Niger, it was, though I always saw myself as African, I felt I never felt more American than when I was with my mother. And so,
Because your mother's white.
because my mother's white, freckled, green eyes. And so while I could often pass for a Nigerian in local communities, the moment I was alongside my mother, I too was considered white, which was more about privilege and access to things like an education or passport, um, or opportunities. Essentially, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world, and they are an agriculture-based country that experiences ongoing drought, and so the economy is low, jobs are low, youth often, defer um, to very, and I kind of equate it to even the States. When youth are impressionable and they don't have opportunity, they defer to some of the most extreme measures. And so not being the case for me, it definitely was very clear what my place was in the country. It is also a predominantly Muslim country. And so what I think that experience taught me was, one, to understand context. And in doing that, as a foreigner, there's a responsibility that you have to understand, to respect, and to go by the rules of the community you're integrating in. And where appropriate, knowing when assimilation is necessary and is the only way to be among community. And so it's just been interesting being an American in Africa, being African, coming back to America, what it looks like to have a white mother in Africa, what it looks like to be mixed in the US. Um,
Very.
those are two different experiences, and there are different sentiments around those. Um, and so I've just had to, I think from a very young age, had to have the responsibility to understand the context, but with that also came some level of wisdom as well. Just knowing.
Was your father ever a part of your life?
My father was part of my life until about, I think we left him, my mother and I left him at 3 years old. He was abusive when I was younger, and I have very vivid memories of that towards my mother. And then there were years that would go by where we didn't speak to him. And after leaving Congo, we went to LA, and then he went to Oakland. Me and my mother went to DC before going to Niger. Every year or so, me and my mother relocated for her work. But every few years, we would visit my father. And we visited my father always together. And that stopped when in high school, my mother was living in Niger and I was living in Seattle. I was going to boarding school at the time. And everyone was going home to their family and their nearby. And I didn't have necessarily anyone to go home to. Like, my mother was overseas. And so being in Seattle, Oakland, where my father was the closest place to me. And so I called my mother and I said, I think I'm going to go to Oakland. And she said, no, you're not. And I said, why? And she told me at age 15 that when my father and my mother and I lived together in LA, that my father had actually sexually abused me. And that was a revelation that it was not part of my understanding until I was 15. I was too young to have those memories. And so, I think when we talked about forgiving ourselves. Sure. Part of my forgiving myself has been in not knowing how to forgive someone else, or not knowing what does forgiveness mean as it relates to ourselves, but also someone else. And so that was definitely a defining moment in my life. And for years after teenage years and into adulthood, I really struggled with what place and power to put this part of my story into the narrative I spoke into myself.
That's tough. And I'm sure it was really hard for your mother to tell you. Mm-hmm. And imagine that a parent never wants a child to know something like that, for it to even have happened. Mm-hmm. And for her to tell you where you wanted to go was to a place that would be safe. I'm sure that's an incredible challenge. Mm-hmm. Going back to your book, we're talking about your stories, but there are many stories in the book. Tell me a bit about the people who you have gathered to tell their stories.
Well, I do consider this book to be an archiving of community. I do believe that when you get a group of amazing women together, and there is a connected tissue between all of us and our lived experiences as Black women in this country and in this world. I have a handful of women in here who are true blue, forever friends, and some which I've known for years, for 10 plus years, and Elaine included. She wrote the foreword, but also an essay. And some others who, as you were speaking to the power of the internet and technology, I have yet to meet in person. But wow. Over the phone, and because this book was birthed in the pandemic, yes. But over the phone, there is a love that has formed with many of these women that runs so deep, just because I see myself in them and they see themselves in me. And so it was important to me to include a range of women from very diverse geographies. We have Morocco and Senegal and Rwanda and across the US represented in this book. And, I think that the beauty in this is that we're all approaching our healing from different lenses. And we talk about identity. For me, it's I frame it in being broader than race, but it's really how we see ourselves. And how we see ourselves informs the decisions we make and how we choose to heal. And the commonality between all of these women is that there's an understanding that life is not linear, and we all have the road to where we are now has ebbed and flowed. And I do believe that every woman in this book also understands that we are all still in the middle of our journeys. And so there is so much to come. But being mature in self awareness and giving grace to our stories was how I chose this beautiful collection of women.
And it is beautiful. Hey guys, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We are talking about this beautiful book called Life I Swear, Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self-Trust. There are 25 women featured in this book, along with Chloe Louvouezo, who is the author and compiler of all of these wonderful stories. There are also beautiful pictures. You get to see
Mhm.
these women in their vibrancy and then read them in their vulnerability and strength. There's a lot of emotion that
Mhm.
is infused into each one of these stories. And each of them, I think you could actually think of it as a meditation. I
Mm.
can imagine reading it and then having your own meditation and then writing what comes up for you because they are soul stirring. And
Mm.
Chloe very generously has offered books to the WBAI family. For your contribution, your donation to WBAI of $60, you can receive a copy of Life I Swear. It is, what I feel like this book is also a great gift. You think of women of all ages, but especially younger women who are kind of going through a lot of growing pains to feel like they're not alone, that they're in good company because each story uh, definitely touches the heart. So, your contribution of $60 to WBAI to ensure our continued lifeblood will you can ask for this book as a gift to you. Life I Swear, Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self-Trust. So you can call us at 212-209-2950 or go online to give to WBAI.org. Again, you just have to let them know you're making a contribution of $60 or more, and you ask for this book, Life I Swear, and it will be sent to you. Uh, Chloe, I appreciate that, especially because of your own story that is nomadic, as you just describe yourself. You have gotten to see a breadth of people of African descent that people don't always know. We share something else. I went to Howard University as well. And
Mhm.
when I got to Howard, and I grew up in Baltimore in
Mhm.
a black neighborhood. So there were black professionals in my whole neighborhood. I thought, and the community I grew up in was a lot of black people doing incredible things. But I went to Howard, and I call it the United Nations of Black people because it was
Mhm.
every type of
Mhm.
person from everywhere in the world and all over the country, all who had different perspectives and ways of growing up. And we often hear about black people in a monolithic way, the worst.
Yep.
It's just black men being the worst ever, and black
Mhm.
women, just the images, the stereotypical images defy what you see when you get to
Yes.
Howard. What was your experience of going to Howard?
Ooh. Well, I am glad to be in good company. um, Howard was, I knew it just made sense for that stage in my life. I had left the continent of Africa. I had gone to Seattle, very lily white environment that I
Yes.
started in. I was at a boarding school, and it was only five what girls of color in the entire high school, white and Asian. I went to, for the second 2 years, a predominantly um, Latino and Black American population. And in that, those 2 years, I did not, it was very hard to navigate among the Black girls there. But so there was just a lot of, as I approached, senior year of high school, there was just a lot of, I know I'm this, but I don't feel comfortable in this. And so I think Howard was so necessary in that season, knowing that I have such a pivotal stage before I am left to my own defenses when I enter into the world. And knowing what I needed then, more than education, was a rooting in the community that I saw myself reflected in. And there's nothing that could have prepared me more for the world than a sense of grounding and community, coming from a lived experience where that just was not the case. My life was very transient before. And so Howard, for many reasons, was the right choice, but for that reason was the choice. And my experience at Howard was much like yours. It was, walking onto the campus of the Mecca. And it's interesting, having grown up in a Muslim country,
Yes.
where everyone in Niger talked about like
Becca.
visiting the Mecca. And so I'm
Yeah.
like, well, let me go to my Mecca. And so even the name, the Mecca, was a word that I had always wondered about growing up. And outside of it being where it was located, to me, even before I knew that of Howard, the Mecca was a place where you go for solidarity. Um, and so that's what I got at Howard, is a true sense of, okay, while the world in these various contexts told me I'm this, or slapped this label on me, told me I'm not this enough, I know who my people are and where I am and who will have my back as I enter into the world. And the diversity was just, like you said, I was in awe.
Yes.
And I think that diversity is important both at Howard and also in the book, in that it lends permission for us to not have this monolithic identity.
Which is so important.
And then we feel that we can be so many things, and we're not trapped into what other people perceive us to be or expect of us, and we can kind of break those walls down.
So we have 2 minutes left. I want to know, what is the message that you offer to your son for what his future can be?
Mm. Well, this book is, I think I write him first in the dedication, because my stories are his. And for me, it's important, as I think about the stories that weren't translated to me, the healing or lack thereof that I did inherit. Um, I want him to be so informed around what and who came before him, so that he has a deeper understanding of who he is and how he can and has permission to show up in the world. I want him to be a feminist. I don't want him to be fearful of vulnerability. And I think when we get fearful of vulnerability, we think we're journeying in a silo. And so for me, the first step in being a community builder, an advocate for your people, is really understanding that we are in this together, whether it's through our healing journey, through our activism, our advocacy, our generational wealth in a very holistic way. Being able to root in that is important.
That's beautiful. Hey
Mhm.
guys, we have been talking to Chloe Louvouezo. Her book, Life I Swear, Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self-Trust, a must read. And thank you, Chloe, for putting this together
Mhm.
during COVID. I have to tell you, I love when people have an incredible story of what they did during this period. for the rest of your life. You will be able
Absolutely.
to say, this is what you birthed during this period
Mhm.
of self-reflection.
Yeah.
It's at least it was self-reflection for those people who chose to look at it that way. And we so appreciate that not only did you do self-reflection, but you gathered up all these stories to help all of us to heal. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. It has been a long time that I have been a fan of you, and I am just grateful to be in your presence this morning.
Well, thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Hey guys, you've been listening to Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. What a wonderful story and journey that Chloe Louvouezo has shared with us. Remember that you can get a copy of this book by making a $60 donation to WBAI. You can call us at 212-209-2950 or go to give2wbai.org. Again, the book is called Life I Swear: Intimate Stories from Black Women on Identity, Healing, and Self Trust. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.